Hi guys, welcome to another deep dive into the shadowy corners of ancient mythology, where gods walked among mortals and love often meant tragedy. Tonight, we're exploring one of the most complex and heartbreaking aspects of Greek mythology, the countless mortal women and men who caught the eye of Zeus, king of the gods, and paid dearly for that divine attention. These aren't just simple love stories or tales of romance. They're stories of transformation, loss, and the terrible price of being desired by the most powerful being in the ancient world. From princesses turned into animals to flee divine wrath, to mothers who gave birth to legendary heroes while hiding from jealous goddesses, each tale reveals the dark side of divine love. We'll journey through these interconnected stories, exploring not just what happened to these individuals, but why their stories have resonated across thousands of years. These myths speak to universal themes of power, desire, jealousy, and the ways that ordinary people become caught up in forces far beyond their control. So settle in as we uncover these tragic tales that have shaped our understanding of love, power, and consequence in the ancient world. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. To understand the tragic nature of these stories, we must first comprehend the nature of Zeus himself and what divine love meant in the ancient Greek understanding of the world. Zeus was not merely a powerful king among gods, but the embodiment of absolute power and authority. His desires were not suggestions or requests that could be declined. They were forces of nature, as inevitable as lightning or thunder. When Zeus desired someone, that desire carried with it all the weight of cosmic authority, making resistance not just difficult, but potentially catastrophic. The ancient Greeks understood that the gods operated by different moral codes than mortals, and their loves were often more about possession and dominance than the tender affection we might associate with romance today. This divine attention was both blessing and curse, elevating mortals to legendary status while simultaneously destroying their normal lives forever. Zeus ruled from Mount Olympus with an authority that extended over both divine and mortal realms, making him the ultimate arbiter of fate and fortune for all beings in the Greek cosmological system. His power was not just political or military, but cosmic in scope. He controlled the weather, dispensed justice, and maintained the fundamental order of the universe. This cosmic authority meant that his personal desires carried the same weight as natural laws, making opposition to them not just dangerous, but essentially impossible. When Zeus wanted something or someone, the entire structure of reality bent to accommodate his will, regardless of the consequences for those caught in the path of his desires. The concept of divine right in ancient Greek culture meant that the gods were not bound by the same moral restrictions that governed mortal behavior. Zeus, as king of the gods, embodied this principle to its fullest extent. His actions were considered inherently justified simply because he was the one performing them, creating a moral framework where divine desire automatically became divine right. This theological understanding made it impossible for mortals to judge or resist divine actions, no matter how harmful those actions might be to human welfare. The gods were understood to be operating according to cosmic principles that mortals could not fully comprehend, making their behavior inherently beyond moral criticism from human perspectives. The psychological impact of divine attention on mortals was understood to be fundamentally transformative, changing not just circumstances, but the very nature of the person who received such attention. Greeks believed that contact with the divine realm altered mortals in permanent ways, marking them as different from ordinary humans regardless of whether that contact was welcome or unwanted. This transformation was seen as both elevation and burden. Those touched by the gods gained legendary status and often supernatural abilities, but they also lost their place in normal human society and became subjects of cosmic forces beyond their control. The ambivalent nature of this transformation reflects the complex Greek understanding of divine favor as something simultaneously desirable and terrifying. The concept of divine love in Greek mythology was intrinsically tied to transformation and loss of agency. When a god loved a mortal, that mortal's story was no longer their own. It became part of the larger narrative of divine will and cosmic order. Zeus, as the supreme deity, possessed the power to reshape reality according to his desires, often literally transforming his lovers or the circumstances around them to achieve his goals. This transformation was rarely consensual and almost always came at tremendous personal cost to the mortal involved. The women and men who became objects of Zeus's affection found themselves stripped of their former identities, separated from their families and communities, and thrust into roles they never chose. Their stories became cautionary tales about the dangerous intersection between divine power and mortal vulnerability, illustrating how quickly a normal life could be upended by forces beyond human understanding or control. What makes these stories particularly tragic is the pattern of abandonment that typically followed Zeus's initial pursuit. Once the god had achieved his desires, he would invariably move on to new interests, leaving his former lovers to face the consequences alone. These consequences were often severe and long-lasting. The wrath of Hera, Zeus's jealous wife, transformation into animals or objects, exile from their homes, or the burden of raising divine children in a world hostile to such offspring. The mortals who attracted Zeus's attention were often young, beautiful, and innocent, making their subsequent suffering all the more poignant. They had no preparation for divine attention and no resources to protect themselves once they had received it. Their stories illustrate the fundamental imbalance between divine power and mortal agency, showing how the gods' casual decisions could reshape human destiny in profound and irreversible ways. Perhaps most tragically, these lovers of Zeus were often blamed for their own suffering by the very communities that should have supported them. Ancient Greek society, like many patriarchal cultures, tended to hold women responsible for the unwanted attention they received, even when that attention came from beings with literally divine power. This blame compounded their isolation and suffering, turning what should have been sources of comfort into additional sources of shame and rejection. The stories of Zeus's lovers thus become not just tales of individual tragedy, but commentaries on how societies respond to victims of powerful predators, revealing uncomfortable truths about blame, shame, and the ways communities sometimes abandon those who need protection most. Understanding this context helps us see these ancient stories not just as entertaining myths, but as profound explorations of power dynamics that remain tragically relevant today. The story of Io represents one of the earliest and most paradigmatic examples of how Zeus's attention could completely destroy a mortal's life while elevating her to mythological significance. Io was a priestess of Hera in Argos, devoted to serving the queen of the gods in her sacred temple. She was known for her exceptional beauty and piety, qualities that unfortunately drew the attention of Zeus as he gazed down from Olympus. Her position as a priestess of Hera makes her story particularly ironic and tragic. She was literally serving the goddess who would become her greatest enemy, simply because Zeus desired her. Io's initial life was one of honor and purpose, respected in her community and devoted to sacred service. But all of this would be stripped away the moment Zeus decided he wanted her for herself. As a priestess of Hera, Io held one of the most prestigious religious positions available to women in ancient Greek society. She had undergone years of training and purification to achieve her sacred role, learning complex rituals and developing deep spiritual connections to the divine realm. Her duties included maintaining the sacred flame in Hera's temple, performing daily offerings and prayers, and serving as an intermediary between the goddess and mortal worshippers who sought Hera's blessing for marriages and family matters. This role required complete dedication and purity, both physical and spiritual, making Io's eventual fate particularly cruel in its violation of everything she held sacred. The Temple of Hera in Argos was one of the most important religious centers in the ancient world, drawing pilgrims from across the Mediterranean who came to seek the goddess's favor and guidance. Io's position as head priestess made her a figure of considerable influence and respect, consulted by nobles and commoners alike for her wisdom and spiritual insight. She had devoted her entire adult life to serving Hera, believing that her chastity and dedication would be rewarded with divine protection and spiritual fulfillment. The irony that Zeus's desire would transform her from Hera's most devoted servant into the goddess's most hated enemy reveals the arbitrary nature of divine favor and the ways that mortals could be destroyed by forces completely beyond their understanding or control. Io's daily life in the temple followed ancient patterns established by generations of priestesses before her. She rose before dawn to kindle the sacred fires and perform the morning rituals that ensured Hera's continued blessing on the city of Argos. Her days were filled with prayer, meditation, and the careful performance of ceremonies that maintained the connection between the divine and mortal realms. She counseled women seeking help with fertility, marriage problems, and family disputes, using her wisdom and spiritual authority to provide comfort and guidance to those in need. This life of service and spiritual dedication had brought Io deep satisfaction and a sense of purpose that made her respected throughout the region. The temple complex where Io served was a marvel of ancient architecture, with marble columns reaching toward the sky and intricate sculptures depicting the stories of Hera and her divine family. The sacred precinct included gardens where Io grew the flowers and herbs used in religious ceremonies, pools for ritual purification, and private chambers where she could retreat for meditation and prayer. This physical environment reflected the spiritual beauty and order that characterized Io's life before Zeus's intervention,
Everything was designed to create harmony between the human and divine realms, providing a sanctuary where mortals could safely commune with the gods without fear of harmful consequences.
The first signs of Zeus's attention came in dreams that began to disturb Eo's previously peaceful sleep. These were not ordinary dreams, but vivid visions filled with divine power that left her shaken and confused upon waking. Initially, she tried to interpret them as messages from Hera, perhaps warnings about threats to the temple or guidance for her priestly duties. But the dreams grew more intense and explicit, clearly emanating from a male divine presence that demanded her attention and submission. The psychological pressure of these nightly visitations began to affect Io's daily functioning, making it difficult for her to concentrate on her duties and creating a constant state of anxiety and spiritual confusion. When Zeus first approached Io, he did so through dreams, appearing to her night after night with increasingly explicit visions of their union. These dreams were not mere fantasies, but divine commands, carrying the full weight of Zeus's power and will. Io found herself torn between her sacred vows to Hera and the undeniable divine pressure she was experiencing. She tried to resist, consulting with her father Inachus, a river god who initially didn't understand the source of his daughter's distress. The dreams became more intense and overwhelming, and eventually Zeus made his intentions clear. Io would be his, whether she chose it or not. This aspect of her story highlights the complete absence of genuine choice that characterized most of Zeus's relationships with mortals. Divine desire was presented as inevitable fate rather than romantic courtship. Unable to resist any longer, Io found herself drawn to secret meetings with Zeus, who appeared to her in various forms to avoid detection by his wife. But Hera, goddess of marriage and Zeus's perpetually suspicious spouse, was not easily fooled. She began to notice her husband's frequent absences and grew suspicious of his activities on Earth. When she descended to investigate, Zeus quickly transformed Io into a beautiful white heifer to hide her identity. This transformation was meant to be temporary, a quick deception to fool Hera, but it became the beginning of Io's true nightmare. Standing there as a cow, still possessing her human mind and emotions but trapped in an animal's body, Io experienced the first taste of the profound alienation that would characterize the rest of her story. Hera was not deceived by Zeus's clumsy attempt at concealment. She immediately recognized the beautiful heifer as something suspicious and demanded it as a gift, knowing that Zeus could not refuse without confirming her suspicions. Zeus, trapped by his wife's cleverness, was forced to give Io to Hera, essentially abandoning his lover to his wife's mercy. Hera then appointed Argus, a giant with 100 eyes, to watch over the heifer constantly. Argus never fully slept, as some of his eyes always remained open, making escape impossible. Io found herself under constant surveillance, unable to communicate her humanity to anyone, unable to eat the food she craved, and unable to live as anything but a beast. The psychological torment of retaining human consciousness while trapped in an animal's body represents one of mythology's most disturbing punishments. The torment continued for months as Io wandered the earth in her bovine form, always watched by the 100-eyed Argus. She encountered her father and sisters at the river, trying desperately to communicate her identity by writing in the sand with her hoof, but they could not fully comprehend the tragedy that had befallen her. Even when they began to understand who she was, they were powerless to help her. She was trapped by divine will, and no mortal could undo what the gods had done. Eventually, Zeus took pity on her situation and sent Hermes to free her by killing Argus. Hermes accomplished this by lulling all 100 eyes to sleep with stories and music, then striking down the giant. But Io's liberation from Argus was only the beginning of new torments, as Hera, furious at the loss of her watchman, sent a gadfly to torment the heifer continuously. Driven mad by the constant stinging of the gadfly, Io began a frenzied journey across the known world, running desperately but never finding relief. She crossed seas and continents, and the body of water she swam across was named the Ionian Sea in her honor, a geographic landmark that would preserve her story for all time. Her wanderings took her through Asia Minor, across the Caucasus Mountains, and eventually to Egypt, covering thousands of miles in her desperate flight from the divinely sent insect. Throughout this journey, she remained trapped between human consciousness and animal form, aware of her tragedy, but powerless to escape it. Local peoples she encountered along the way saw only a mad cow, never suspecting the human soul trapped within. Her story spread as she traveled, creating a trail of myths and legends that connected distant lands through her suffering. Finally, after years of torment, Io reached Egypt, where Zeus at last restored her human form and ended her persecution. But even this mercy came with complications. She was now far from home, in a foreign land where she knew no one and spoke no language. She had to rebuild her entire life from nothing, creating a new identity in a new culture. Zeus visited her there and fathered a child, Epithus, whose descendants would include famous figures like Perseus and Heracles. While Io eventually founded a dynasty and achieved a form of immortality through her legendary status, the cost had been enormous. Years of suffering, complete alienation from her former life, and psychological trauma that would mark her forever. Her story established the template for many of Zeus's later relationships: initial resistance, transformation as punishment, abandonment to Hera's wrath, and eventual elevation to mythological status through suffering rather than joy. The tale of Europa presents another variation on the theme of Zeus's deceptive pursuit of mortal women, but this time the god's approach was more subtle and the initial deception more complete. Europa was a Phoenician princess, daughter of King Agenor of Tyre, living a life of privilege and beauty in her father's palace. She was known throughout the land for her exceptional loveliness and grace, spending her days in innocent pleasures with her companions, never suspecting that her beauty had caught the attention of the king of the gods. Unlike Io, who received warning through dreams, Europa had no preparation for what was about to befall her. Zeus's approach was sudden, complete, and carefully calculated to overcome any resistance through deception rather than force. The kingdom of Tyre was one of the most prosperous and sophisticated civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean, renowned for its skilled craftsmen, wealthy merchants, and powerful navy that controlled much of the sea trade between East and West. Europa's father, King Agenor, ruled over this maritime empire with wisdom and strength, creating a peaceful and cultured environment where his daughter could flourish. The royal palace was a center of learning and artistic achievement, filled with scholars, poets, and musicians who contributed to the intellectual and cultural development of the kingdom. Europa grew up surrounded by beauty and refinement, educated in literature, music, and the arts that befitted a princess of her high station. As the daughter of such a powerful king, Europa was expected to make a marriage that would strengthen political alliances and expand Phoenician influence throughout the region. Ambassadors from neighboring kingdoms regularly visited Tyre to negotiate potential matches, offering rich dowries and advantageous treaties in exchange for the honor of marrying King Agenor's beautiful daughter. But Europa was still young and enjoyed the freedom of her unmarried state, spending her time with her companions in pursuits that brought her joy and fulfillment. She loved to dance, sing, and create beautiful embroideries that depicted scenes from nature and mythology, displaying an artistic talent that was admired throughout the court. The morning of her abduction began like any other pleasant day in Europa's privileged life. She had planned to spend time with her companions on the beach near Tyre, gathering flowers and enjoying the warm sunshine and gentle sea breezes. The group of young women looked forward to these outings as opportunities to escape the formal constraints of court life and enjoy simple pleasures in natural surroundings. They brought baskets for collecting wildflowers, which they would later weave into garlands for their hair or use to decorate the palace rooms. The beach they favored was secluded and beautiful, with soft white sand and clear blue water that reflected the cloudless sky above. Europa wore her favorite dress that day, a flowing white garment embroidered with golden threads that caught the sunlight and emphasized her natural grace and beauty. Her hair was arranged in elaborate braids, adorned with jewels that had been gifts from her father, and she moved with the confident elegance of someone who had never known fear or hardship. Her companions were daughters of noble families, equally beautiful and refined, creating a group of young women who represented the finest flowering of Phoenician civilization. Their laughter and conversation filled the air as they made their way to the beach, anticipating hours of carefree enjoyment in each other's company. The appearance of the magnificent white bull initially seemed like an unusual but delightful addition to their pleasant morning. The creature was unlike any animal they had ever seen, with hide that gleamed like fresh snow and eyes that held an almost human intelligence. Its presence on the beach was mysterious, as no one could explain where it had come from or who might own such an extraordinary animal. The bull's behavior was equally unusual. Instead of showing the aggressive territoriality typical of male cattle, it approached the group of women with gentle curiosity, as if seeking their company and approval. Its movements were graceful and controlled, displaying none of the clumsy heaviness associated with ordinary bulls. Europa's companions were initially cautious, maintaining a respectful distance while admiring the bull's exceptional beauty and unusual demeanor. But Europa herself felt an immediate attraction to the creature that she could not explain, sensing something almost magical about its presence. She approached slowly, speaking to it in the soft, melodious voice that had always been one of her most charming qualities. The bull responded to her approach with obvious pleasure, lowering its massive head as if inviting her touch. When she reached out to stroke its forehead, the contact sent a thrill of excitement through her, as if she were touching something divine rather than merely animal. Zeus chose to approach Europa in the form of a magnificent white bull, one of the most beautiful animals anyone had ever seen. This was no ordinary bull, but a creature of divine perfection. Its hide was snow white and lustrous, its horns gleamed like polished gems, and its eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. The bull appeared while Europa was playing with her companions on the beach near Tyre, gathering flowers and enjoying the pleasant morning air. At first, the young women were cautious, but the bull's gentle behavior and extraordinary beauty soon enchanted them. Europa was particularly drawn to the creature, admiring its magnificence and gradually losing her fear as it showed no signs of aggression. The bull knelt before her as if inviting her to approach, and she began to pet its head and decorate its horns with flower garlands. The transformation of Europa's fear into trust represents one of the most psychologically complex aspects of her story. Zeus had chosen his disguise perfectly, appearing as something beautiful and seemingly harmless that would appeal to Europa's innocent nature. The bull allowed her to touch it, pet it, and eventually even climb onto its back, each step carefully calculated to make her feel safe and in control. This gradual seduction through apparent gentleness makes Zeus's ultimate betrayal all the more disturbing, as Europa's trust was systematically cultivated only to be catastrophically violated. When she finally climbed onto the bull's back, laughing with her friends at her own daring, she had no idea she was placing herself completely at the mercy of a god who had already decided her fate. The moment Europa settled onto the bull's back, Zeus revealed his true intentions. Without warning, he plunged into the sea, carrying the terrified princess away from everything she had ever known. Europa cried out for her father, her friends, and her homeland, but her voice was lost over the rushing water as the divine bull swam with supernatural speed across the Mediterranean. She clung to the creature's horns in terror, watching her homeland disappear behind her and realizing that her life as she knew it was over. The journey across the sea represents the complete severing of Europa's connection to her former life. With each wave that passed beneath them, she was carried further from safety, family, and familiarity into an unknown future entirely controlled by divine will. Zeus carried Europa to the island of Crete, where he finally revealed his true identity and made his intentions clear. The island would become Europa's new home, but it was a gilded prison rather than a paradise. While Zeus showered her with gifts and honors, making her queen of Crete and surrounding her with luxury, she remained fundamentally a captive, cut off from her family and homeland by divine decree. Her father, King Agenor, sent her brothers to search for her, with strict instructions never to return without her. But their quest was doomed to failure. No mortal could retrieve someone claimed by Zeus. Her brothers wandered the world for years, eventually founding new cities and kingdoms in their futile search, but Europa remained lost to them forever. Her abduction had scattered her entire family across the Mediterranean, destroying the unity of a generous house and creating a diaspora of Phoenician princes. On Crete, Europa bore Zeus 3 sons: Minos, who would become the legendary king and lawgiver of Crete, Rhadamanthus, who would become a judge of the dead, and Sarpedon, who would become a great warrior. These children were destined for greatness, but their birth came at the cost of their mother's former life and identity. Europa eventually married Asterion, the king of Crete, who adopted her divine sons, but she never forgot her homeland or the family she had been forced to leave behind. The continent that bears her name serves as a permanent monument to her story. Every time we speak of Europe, we invoke the memory of a young woman whose innocent trust was exploited by divine power. Her legacy is thus paradoxical. She gave her name to an entire continent and became the mother of legendary kings, but only through suffering and irreversible loss of agency and homeland. The story of Leda introduces us to yet another dimension of Zeus's deceptive approaches to mortal women, demonstrating how the god could exploit even the most intimate and private moments. Leda was the wife of King Tyndareus of Sparta, a woman of exceptional beauty and virtue who had never given any indication of unfaithfulness to her husband. She lived a life of royal dignity and domestic happiness, respected by her people and devoted to her family duties. Her contentment and loyalty, rather than protecting her from divine attention, seemed to make her even more attractive to Zeus, who was drawn to the challenge of seducing a woman who had never shown interest in any man other than her husband. The targeting of such a virtuous woman reveals the predatory nature of Zeus's desires. He was not content with willing partners, but actively sought to corrupt those who appeared most resistant to his advances. Sparta, in Leda's time, was a kingdom known for its military prowess and strict social order, but also for the relatively high status accorded to women compared to other Greek city-states. Spartan women were expected to be strong, intelligent, and capable of managing household affairs while their husbands were away on military campaigns. Leda embodied these ideals perfectly, serving as both queen and administrator, while Tyndareus led Spartan forces in various conflicts throughout the Peloponnese. Her reputation for wisdom and fairness made her a respected figure, not just within Sparta, but throughout the Greek world, where other royal women looked to her as a model of proper queenly behavior. The royal palace in Sparta was a place of austere beauty, reflecting the Spartan values of strength and functionality, rather than luxury and display. Leda had helped design many of the palace's features, ensuring that they served practical purposes while also creating an environment of dignity befitting her husband's royal status. She took particular pride in the palace gardens, where she grew medicinal herbs and food plants that could sustain the royal household during times of siege or hardship. These gardens also served as a peaceful retreat where she could find solitude and reflection away from the demands of public life. Leda's daily routine involved a careful balance of public duties and private devotions. She held audiences with citizens who brought disputes for royal judgment, managed the complex logistics of feeding and housing the palace staff and guards, and maintained correspondence with other royal women throughout Greece. Her intelligence and diplomatic skills made her an invaluable advisor to her husband, and many of Sparta's most successful policies reflected her influence and insight. She also devoted time each day to physical exercise and weapons training, following Spartan customs that emphasized the importance of physical strength and martial skills for both men and women. The river Eurotas held special significance for Leda and for Spartan religious life more generally. The river was considered sacred to various gods and nymphs, making its banks a place where divine and mortal realms intersected more closely than in ordinary locations. Leda often went to the river for ritual purification and private prayer, finding in its flowing waters a source of spiritual renewal that helped her maintain the mental and emotional strength required for her demanding royal responsibilities. The river's beauty and tranquility made it an ideal location for contemplation and meditation, allowing her to connect with the natural world and the divine forces that governed it. On the day of Zeus's assault, Leda had gone to the river seeking solitude and spiritual refreshment after a particularly challenging period of royal duties. She had been dealing with complex negotiations involving military alliances and trade agreements, requiring her to spend long hours in council meetings and diplomatic discussions that left her mentally exhausted. The peaceful environment of the riverbank offered a welcome contrast to the intensity of palace life, allowing her to relax her guard and simply enjoy the beauty of the natural world around her. She had come alone, without her usual retinue of servants and guards, treasuring these rare moments of privacy and personal freedom. The attack by Zeus in the form of a swan was sudden and overwhelming, catching Leda completely unprepared for such an assault. Her first instinct was to help what appeared to be a bird in distress, opening her arms to provide protection from a supposed predator. This act of compassion and mercy became the trap that sealed her fate, as her kindness was immediately exploited by the disguised god. The transformation from helper to victim occurred so quickly that Leda had no time to understand what was happening or to mount any effective resistance. Her natural instincts toward nurturing and protection were turned against her in the cruelest possible way. The psychological trauma of the assault was compounded by its location at the sacred river, a place where Leda had always felt safe and spiritually protected. The violation of this sanctuary added a religious dimension to the personal harm she had suffered, making it impossible for her to return to the river for the spiritual renewal it had previously provided. The place that had been her refuge from the stresses of royal life was forever associated with helplessness and violation, eliminating one of the few sources of personal peace and strength she had maintained despite her demanding public responsibilities. Zeus chose to approach Leda in the form of a swan, appearing to her while she was bathing alone by the river Europa. The choice of this particular form was calculated to exploit Leda's compassionate nature. The swan appeared to be in distress, apparently fleeing from an eagle that was pursuing it. Leda's first instinct was to protect the beautiful bird, opening her arms to provide sanctuary from its supposed predator. This moment of compassion became the trap that sealed her fate, as the swan immediately revealed its true nature and overpowered her defenses. The irony that her very virtue and kindness were used against her makes Leda's story particularly tragic. She was punished for possessing exactly the qualities that should have made her admirable and worthy of protection. The encounter with Zeus left Leda in an impossible situation that would have consequences extending far beyond her own life. She found herself pregnant, but the nature of her pregnancy was unprecedented, even in a world accustomed to divine interventions. According to the most common version of her story, Leda laid 2 eggs, from which hatched 4 children: Helen and Polydeuces, fathered by Zeus, and Castor and Clytemnestra, fathered by her husband Tyndarus on the same night. This extraordinary birth created a family situation of impossible complexity, as Leda had to raise children who were simultaneously siblings and half-siblings, some divine and some mortal, all born from the same mother but conceived in radically different circumstances. The burden of keeping Zeus's true identity secret while raising his divine children alongside her mortal ones created ongoing psychological stress for Leda. She could never openly acknowledge what had happened to her, both because no one would believe such an extraordinary story, and because revealing Zeus's involvement could bring down Hera's wrath upon her entire family. Instead,
She had to maintain the fiction that all 4 children were legitimate offspring of her marriage to Tyndareus, while privately knowing that 2 of them carried divine blood that would inevitably lead them to extraordinary destinies.
The divine twins, Polydeuces and Helen, showed signs of their supernatural heritage from early childhood, possessing beauty and abilities that clearly marked them as different from ordinary mortals. Helen, the daughter born from Zeus's assault, would grow up to become Helen of Troy, whose beauty would launch 1,000 ships and cause the most devastating war in Greek mythology. Clytemnestra would become the wife of Agamemnon and eventually his murderer, driven to revenge by her husband's sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia. Castor and Polydeuces would become the famous Dioscuri, divine protectors of sailors and warriors. Each of these children would play crucial roles in the greatest stories of Greek mythology, but their legendary status came directly from the trauma inflicted upon their mother. Leda's violation by Zeus created ripple effects that would shape the entire course of the Trojan War and its aftermath, demonstrating how divine interference in mortal lives could have consequences lasting for generations. The tragedy of Leda's story lies not just in the initial assault, but in how it transformed her from a subject of her own life into merely a vessel for producing legendary children. Her identity became subsumed into her role as mother of famous offspring, with her own experience and suffering largely forgotten in favor of focusing on her children's achievements. She lived to see Helen's beauty cause international conflict, watched Clytemnestra descend into murderous revenge, and witnessed Castor and Polydeuces achieve divine honors through their heroic deeds. Each of these outcomes could be traced back to that moment by the river when her compassion was exploited by a god in disguise, making her simultaneously one of the most influential and most tragic figures in Greek mythology. The story of Danae reveals how even the most extreme precautions could not protect a mortal woman from Zeus's determined pursuit, while also exploring themes of prophecy, fate, and the futility of trying to avoid divine will. Danae was the daughter of Acrisius, king of Argos, who received a terrifying prophecy from the oracle at Delphi. His daughter would bear a son who would eventually kill him. Desperate to avoid this fate, Acrisius made the tragic decision to imprison his own daughter in a bronze tower, keeping her completely isolated from all male contact. This imprisonment was intended to ensure that Danae could never conceive a child, but it actually created the perfect conditions for Zeus to demonstrate that no mortal barrier could prevent divine will from being fulfilled. King Acrisius had ruled Argos for many years with wisdom and strength, building the kingdom into one of the most prosperous and stable realms in the ancient Greek world. His reign had been marked by successful military campaigns, beneficial trade relationships, and the construction of magnificent public works that enhanced both the beauty and functionality of his capital city. Acrisius took great pride in his achievements and looked forward to passing on his kingdom to a worthy heir who would continue the dynasty he had worked so hard to establish. The prophecy about his daughter's son came as a devastating blow to his plans and expectations, threatening to destroy everything he had built. The oracle at Delphi was the most respected prophetic authority in the ancient world, consulted by kings and commoners alike for guidance on matters of vital importance. When Acrisius made the journey to Delphi to seek divine wisdom about his succession, he expected to receive encouraging news about his daughter's future and the continuation of his royal line. Instead, He learned that his beloved daughter would give birth to his own destroyer, creating an impossible dilemma that would force him to choose between his love for Danae and his desperate desire to avoid the prophesied fate. The oracle's words carried the full weight of divine authority, making them impossible to dismiss as mere superstition or wishful thinking. Danae's childhood and early youth had been filled with joy and privilege, as the beloved only child of a powerful king who doted on her and provided her with every luxury and opportunity available to a princess of her status. She received the finest education available, learning to read and write in multiple languages, studying mathematics and astronomy, and developing sophisticated understanding of literature, music, and the visual arts. Her father had always encouraged her intellectual development, believing that a well-educated daughter would make advantageous political alliances through marriage, while also serving as a capable advisor to her future husband and children. The princess had grown into a young woman of exceptional beauty and intelligence, admired throughout the kingdom and beyond for her grace, wit, and compassionate nature. She had inherited her father's keen mind and strong will, along with her mother's legendary beauty and artistic talents. Danae's reputation had spread throughout the Greek world, attracting marriage proposals from princes and kings who saw her as an ideal wife who would bring both political advantages and personal happiness to their union. Her future had seemed bright and full of promise, making the sudden change in her circumstances all the more tragic and shocking. The construction of the bronze tower that would become Danae's prison required months of careful planning and enormous expenditure of royal resources. Acrisius spared no expense in creating what he believed would be an impregnable fortress designed to keep his daughter completely isolated from any contact with men, while still providing her with adequate comfort and safety. The tower was built with walls of solid bronze, several feet thick, making it impossible for anyone to break in or for Danae to break out. The only opening was a small aperture in the roof through which food, water, and other necessities could be lowered, ensuring that Danae would remain completely cut off from the outside world. The interior of the tower was furnished with every luxury that Acrisius could provide within the constraints of his daughter's imprisonment. Rich tapestries covered the bronze walls, comfortable furniture provided places for rest and recreation, and carefully selected books and musical instruments offered intellectual and artistic stimulation during the long years of isolation. Servants specially chosen for their loyalty and discretion were responsible for maintaining the tower and caring for Danae's needs, but they were forbidden from engaging in any conversation beyond what was necessary for practical purposes. Even these servants were women, ensuring that Danae would have no contact whatsoever with any male presence. The psychological impact of this imprisonment on Danae was devastating and long-lasting, transforming a vibrant young woman accustomed to freedom and social interaction into an isolated captive whose only company was her own thoughts and memories. The sudden transition from palace life filled with people, activities, and stimulation to complete solitude in a confined space created profound depression and anxiety that made each day a struggle for survival. She spent hours each day standing beneath the small opening in the roof, looking up at the patch of sky that represented her only connection to the outside world, dreaming of the life and freedom that had been stolen from her. Despite the luxury of her physical surroundings, Danae's existence in the tower was one of profound deprivation. Deprived of human companionship, deprived of physical freedom, deprived of the opportunity to use her education and talents for any meaningful purpose, and deprived of hope for any future beyond the bronze walls that contained her. She tried to maintain her sanity and spirit through rigorous intellectual exercise, composing poetry and music that no one would ever hear, solving mathematical problems that served no purpose beyond occupying her mind, and creating elaborate stories and fantasies that allowed her to escape mentally from her physical prison. Danae's imprisonment in the Bronze Tower represents one of mythology's most vivid symbols of patriarchal control taken to its extreme conclusion. She was essentially buried alive, cut off from sunlight, human companionship, and all the normal pleasures of life, all because her father feared a prophecy about her future child. The tower had no doors or windows, only a small opening in the roof through which food was lowered, making it a prison designed to contain her completely. Danae spent years in this isolation, growing from a young woman into full adulthood without experiencing any of the normal relationships or experiences that should have been her birthright. Her father's attempt to control her fertility through imprisonment reveals the extreme measures that patriarchal societies were willing to take to control women's reproductive capacity, even at the cost of their basic humanity. Zeus discovered Danae in her tower prison and was moved by both her beauty and her plight, but his solution to her suffering was not liberation, but rather a different form of conquest. He chose to visit her in the form of golden rain, seeping through the bronze walls and filling her prison with divine light and presence. This transformation into golden rain allowed Zeus to penetrate even the most secure prison, demonstrating that divine power could not be contained by any mortal construction. The imagery of golden rain is both beautiful and disturbing. It represents divine abundance and blessing, but also an invasion that Danae could not prevent or escape. Trapped in her bronze tower, she had no way to resist or flee from Zeus's attention, making her one of the most clearly victimized of his lovers. The conception of Perseus, Danae's son by Zeus, occurred in circumstances of complete powerlessness on her part. She was literally captive, unable to give or withhold consent, when Zeus impregnated her with the child who would become one of Greece's greatest heroes. The pregnancy presented Danae with new terrors. How could she explain her condition to her father, who had imprisoned her precisely to prevent such an occurrence? When Perseus was born, Acrisius was faced with the proof that his precautions had failed, but he was too afraid of divine retribution to harm the child directly. Instead, he chose another desperate measure, sealing both Danae and the infant Perseus into a wooden chest and casting them into the sea, hoping that the gods would accomplish what he dared not do himself. The voyage in the wooden chest represents Danae's second imprisonment, this one potentially fatal for both her and her innocent child. Floating on the uncertain waves, she had no control over their destination or survival, completely at the mercy of wind, current, and divine intervention. She spent hours or days in the darkness of the chest, holding her infant son and not knowing whether each moment would be their last. This experience of absolute helplessness and terror while trying to protect her child reveals the depth of Danae's courage. Even in the most desperate circumstances, she remained focused on her maternal duties rather than succumbing to despair. The chest eventually washed ashore on the island of Seriphos, where they were rescued by a fisherman named Dictys, but their survival was more a matter of divine providence than any human agency. On Seriphos, Danae finally found a measure of peace and safety, raising Perseus in relative obscurity while he grew into the hero who would fulfill the prophecy by accidentally killing his grandfather. But even this happy ending came at enormous cost. Danae had lost her youth to imprisonment, her homeland to exile, and her family to fear and prophecy. She had been used as a pawn in cosmic games she never understood, suffering imprisonment, assault, and exile not for any crime she had committed, but simply because she was born into a family touched by prophetic doom. Her story illustrates how women in Greek mythology were often reduced to their reproductive function, valued not for their own qualities, but for the children they might bear, and the destinies those children might fulfill. The tale of Alcmene presents us with one of Zeus's most elaborate deceptions, involving not just disguise, but the manipulation of time itself to achieve his desires. Alcmene was the wife of Amphitryon, a Theban general known for his valor and nobility. She was renowned for her virtue and intelligence, as well as her exceptional beauty, and was considered one of the most admirable women of her generation. Her marriage to Amphitryon was based on genuine love and mutual respect, making her one of the few women in these stories who began with a happy and fulfilling relationship before Zeus's intervention destroyed her peace. The strength of her marriage and her reputation for faithfulness actually made her more attractive to Zeus, who seemed to take particular pleasure in corrupting relationships that appeared most secure. Zeus's approach to Alcmene was perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated of all his seductions, demonstrating a level of manipulation that went far beyond simple disguise or force. He chose to impersonate Amphitryon himself, appearing to Alcmene in the exact likeness of her beloved husband. But Zeus went further than mere physical resemblance. He possessed intimate knowledge of Amphitryon's mannerisms, speech patterns, and private memories, making his impersonation completely convincing. To make the deception perfect, Zeus also manipulated time, extending their night together far beyond its natural length to maximize his pleasure while ensuring that Alcmene would never suspect anything unusual had occurred. From her perspective, she was simply enjoying an exceptionally passionate reunion with her husband after his return from military campaign. The complexity of Zeus's deception meant that Alcmene was violated without ever knowing it, a form of assault that was perhaps more psychologically damaging than overt force. She gave herself willingly to someone she believed was her husband, experiencing what she thought was the deepest expression of marital love, only to discover later that she had been deceived by a god who had stolen her husband's identity to use her for his own purposes. When the real Amphitryon returned the next day, expecting the warm welcome of a wife who had missed him, he was confused by Alcmene's apparent coolness and her references to their passionate reunion the night before. This confusion led to the gradual revelation of Zeus's deception, destroying the trust and intimacy that had been the foundation of their marriage. The discovery that Zeus had impersonated her husband created an impossible situation for Alcmene, who found herself pregnant with a divine child while her marriage crumbled under the weight of supernatural interference. Amphitryon struggled to understand how his wife could have been deceived so completely, while Alcmene had to cope with the realization that her most intimate moments had been based on a lie. The pregnancy itself became a source of ongoing torment, as Hera, learning of her husband's latest infidelity, interfered with the birth to delay it and cause Alcmene maximum suffering. The labor lasted for 7 days and nights, with Alcmene in agony, while Hera's servants prevented the birth through magical intervention. When Heracles was finally born, along with his twin brother Iphicles, conceived by Amphitryon on the night after Zeus's visit, Alcmene found herself raising the future greatest hero of Greek mythology alongside a normal mortal child. Heracles displayed signs of his divine heritage from infancy, strangling serpents that Hera sent to kill him in his cradle. But this supernatural strength also marked him as different and potentially dangerous. Alcmene had to constantly worry about her divine son's safety while also protecting her mortal son from the jealousy and violence that Heracles' presence attracted. The simple joy of motherhood was complicated by the knowledge that her divine child was destined for a life of conflict and suffering, much of it stemming from Hera's eternal hatred. The long-term consequences of Zeus's deception extended far beyond the immediate family. Heracles grew up to become the greatest hero of the ancient world, but his achievements came at the cost of tremendous suffering for himself and everyone around him. His divine strength made him capable of incredible feats, but Hera's persistent persecution drove him to temporary madness, in which he killed his own wife and children, requiring him to perform his famous 12 labors as penance. Alcmene lived to see her son achieve immortal glory, but only after watching him endure decades of torment and conflict. Her story demonstrates how Zeus's casual desires could reshape entire family lineages and create legends that would last for millennia, but always at tremendous personal cost to the women who became instruments of divine will. The story of Ganymede represents a departure from the typical pattern of Zeus's relationships with mortal women, but it illustrates many of the same themes of divine predation and the destruction of normal life through unwanted divine attention. Ganymede was a young Trojan prince, son of King Tros, renowned throughout the ancient world for his exceptional beauty. He was described as the most beautiful mortal youth who had ever lived, with features so perfect that he seemed almost divine himself. Unlike the women in previous stories, Ganymede had no warning or preparation for Zeus's interest. He was simply living his life as a prince of Troy, learning statecraft and military skills, when the king of the gods decided that he must possess this beautiful youth for his own pleasure. Zeus's approach to Ganymede was characteristically direct and overwhelming, involving no subtle seduction or gradual courtship. The god transformed himself into a magnificent eagle, the largest and most powerful bird anyone had ever seen, with golden feathers and eyes that blazed with divine fire. While Ganymede was shepherding his father's flocks on Mount Ida, far from the protection of the city walls, the divine eagle swooped down and seized him in its talons. The transformation into an eagle allowed Zeus to use his superior strength and mobility to simply take what he wanted, bypassing any possibility of resistance or negotiation. Ganymede found himself lifted high into the air, watching the familiar landscape of his homeland shrink away beneath him as he was carried off to an unknown fate. The abduction of Ganymede created immediate political and personal crises that extended far beyond the individual tragedy. As a prince of Troy, Ganymede was not just a private person, but a public figure whose disappearance affected the entire kingdom. His father, King Tros, was devastated by the loss of his beloved son, not knowing whether the youth was alive or dead, while the kingdom mourned the loss of a promising future ruler. The mystery of Ganymede's disappearance created uncertainty and anxiety throughout Troy, as no one could explain how a healthy young man could simply vanish without a trace.
Search parties scoured the countryside, but no mortal investigation could uncover the truth of divine abduction.
On Olympus, Ganymede found himself in a situation of impossible complexity, elevated to divine status, but at the cost of everything he had previously known and valued. Zeus made him cupbearer to the gods, a position of honor that was nonetheless fundamentally one of servitude.
Ganymede was given immortality and eternal youth, remaining forever at the same age he had been when abducted, but this gift came with the obligation to serve Zeus's pleasure for all eternity.
He was dressed in fine clothes, surrounded by luxury, and treated as a privileged member of the divine court, but he remained essentially a captive, unable to return to his family or former life. The other gods treated him with courtesy, but he was always aware that his position depended entirely on Zeus's continued desire for his company. The psychological impact of Ganymede's situation was profound and enduring. He had been transformed from a free prince with unlimited potential into a divine servant whose entire existence revolved around pleasing his captor. The immortality that was supposed to be a blessing became a curse, as it meant he could never escape or forget his circumstances through the natural passage of time. He was forced to watch from Olympus as his mortal family aged and died, unable to comfort them or explain his fate. His father's grief and the kingdom's uncertainty became sources of constant guilt and sorrow, as Ganymede knew he was alive and well, but could never send word to those who mourned him. Eventually, Zeus attempted to compensate King Tros for the loss of his son by sending him a herd of divine horses and a golden vine, along with a message explaining that Ganymede had been honored with immortality and a place among the gods. But these gifts, however valuable, could never replace a beloved child, and Tros continued to mourn the loss of his son's physical presence and the normal relationship they should have shared. Ganymede himself was eventually placed among the stars as the constellation Aquarius, the water-bearer, ensuring that his story would be remembered for all time. But this celestial honor, like his immortality, was a consolation prize for a life that had been fundamentally altered without his consent, demonstrating how divine attention could transform even apparent rewards into forms of eternal imprisonment. The story of Callisto reveals another dimension of Zeus's predatory behavior, while also exploring themes of identity, betrayal, and the price of innocence. Callisto was one of Artemis's virgin huntresses, a young woman who had sworn sacred vows to remain chaste and devoted to the goddess of the hunt. She lived in the forests of Arcadia with her fellow huntresses, leading a life of freedom and adventure that was unusual for women in the ancient world. Her dedication to Artemis represented a rejection of traditional feminine roles in favor of independence and self-determination, making her one of the few women in these stories who had actively chosen a life outside the normal expectations of marriage and motherhood. This independence and her sacred vows to remain virgin made her particularly attractive to Zeus, who seemed to take special pleasure in violating oaths and corrupting those who had dedicated themselves to chastity. The cult of Artemis offered one of the few paths available to ancient Greek women who wished to live independent lives, free from male authority and the demands of marriage and childbearing.
Women who joined Artemis's band of huntresses underwent rigorous training in woodland survival, archery, tracking, and other skills that allowed them to live self-sufficiently in the wilderness. They swore sacred oaths of chastity and devotion to their goddess, pledging to remain virgin for life in exchange for the freedom and protection that Artemis provided. This alternative lifestyle attracted women from all social classes who preferred the challenges and independence of the hunt to the constraints of traditional domestic roles. Callisto had joined Artemis's huntresses as a very young woman, drawn by the promise of adventure and the opportunity to develop her natural talents for archery and wilderness survival. She quickly proved herself to be one of the most skilled members of the group, capable of tracking even the most elusive prey and taking down dangerous animals with her bow. Her fellow huntresses respected her abilities and looked to her for leadership during particularly challenging hunts. The life suited her perfectly. She loved the physical demands of hunting, the mental challenges of tracking and strategy, and the close bonds of sisterhood that developed among women who shared the same dedication and values. The forests of Arcadia, where Callisto and her companions made their home, were among the most beautiful and pristine wilderness areas in the ancient Greek world. Dense woodlands filled with oak, pine, and cedar trees provided habitat for deer, wild boar, bears, and other game animals that the huntresses pursued. Clear streams and natural springs supplied fresh water, while meadows and clearings offered spaces for the group to make temporary camps during their hunting expeditions. The natural beauty and abundance of the region made it seem like a paradise designed specifically for those who loved the outdoor life and preferred nature to civilization. Callisto's daily routine as a huntress involved rising before dawn to track game animals while they were still active in the cool morning air. She would spend hours moving silently through the forest, reading signs and following trails with the expertise that had made her famous among her sisters. Her skill with the bow was legendary. She could bring down a running deer at remarkable distances, and had once saved her companions from a charging bear with a single perfectly placed arrow. These abilities made her valuable not just as a hunter, but as a protector of the group, capable of defending her sisters against both animal predators and human threats. The huntresses lived according to strict codes of behavior that reflected their devotion to Artemis and their commitment to maintaining the purity and discipline that their goddess demanded. They avoided contact with men whenever possible, conducted regular rituals of purification and prayer, and maintained their bodies in peak physical condition through constant training and exercise. Their camp was organized with military precision, each woman having specific responsibilities for hunting, cooking, equipment maintenance, and security. This disciplined lifestyle created a strong sense of community and shared purpose that made the group function effectively despite the challenges of wilderness living. Artemis herself often visited her huntresses, appearing to them during their hunts or in their dreams to provide guidance and encouragement. These divine visitations were among the most treasured experiences in the huntresses' lives, confirming that their goddess valued their service and dedication. Callisto had been particularly favored with such visits, receiving praise from Artemis for her hunting skills and leadership qualities. These experiences had strengthened her devotion to the goddess and her commitment to the life she had chosen, making her completely unprepared for the deception that would destroy everything she valued. The morning of Zeus's assault began like any other hunting day, with Callisto tracking a particularly elusive deer through the dense forest undergrowth.
She had separated from her companions to follow the animal's trail, confident in her abilities and familiar with the terrain. The hunt had taken her far from the main camp, into a secluded valley where ancient trees created a cathedral-like atmosphere of peace and natural beauty. It was in this isolated location that Zeus chose to approach her, taking advantage of her solitude to ensure that no one would witness or interrupt his planned deception. Zeus's approach to Callisto was one of his most insidious deceptions, as he chose to appear in the form of Artemis herself. This disguise was particularly cruel because it exploited Callisto's trust in her goddess and her devotion to her chosen way of life. When Zeus appeared as Artemis, Callisto welcomed him with joy and relief, happy to see her beloved goddess after a long separation. She had no reason to suspect deception. Who would dare impersonate a goddess? And why would anyone want to harm a faithful servant? The false Artemis embraced Callisto warmly, and in that moment of trust and affection, Zeus revealed his true nature and overpowered her completely. The violation was doubly traumatic, because it came at the moment when Callisto felt safest and most secure in her devotion. The aftermath of Zeus's assault left Callisto in an impossible position that would only worsen with time. She could not tell anyone what had happened because the truth was too extraordinary to be believed. Who would accept that Zeus had impersonated Artemis to deceive her? She also feared that revealing the assault would bring shame upon herself and possibly divine retribution upon anyone she told. So she kept silent, trying to continue her life as a huntress while carrying the secret trauma of what had been done to her. For months, she managed to hide her condition through loose clothing and careful positioning, but pregnancy cannot be concealed indefinitely. When she could no longer hide her condition, the discovery came in the most humiliating way possible, while bathing with her fellow huntresses at a sacred spring. When Callisto's pregnancy was discovered, the reaction was swift and merciless. Artemis, goddess of virginity and the hunt, was furious at what she perceived as a betrayal of sacred vows. The goddess had no interest in hearing explanations or understanding the circumstances. In her mind, Callisto had broken her vow of chastity and must face the consequences. The other huntresses, who had been Callisto's sisters and companions, turned against her with the righteous anger of those who felt betrayed by someone they had trusted. Callisto tried to explain what had really happened, but her story of divine impersonation and assault sounded like the desperate lie of someone caught in shameful behavior. No one believed that Zeus would stoop to such deception, and her protests only seemed to make her appear more guilty and dishonest. Artemis banished Callisto from her service immediately, stripping her of her identity as a huntress and casting her out into the wilderness alone. This banishment was devastating, not just practically, but emotionally, as Callisto lost not only her home and companions, but her entire sense of self. She had defined herself as a huntress of Artemis for so long that exile from that role left her with no clear identity or purpose. Pregnant and alone, she wandered through forests that had once been her joyful hunting grounds, but now seemed hostile and unwelcoming. The skills that had made her an excellent huntress, tracking, archery, survival in the wilderness, became the only things that kept her alive in her new existence as an outcast. When Callisto gave birth to her son Arcas, she faced new challenges and terrors. Raising a divine child alone in the wilderness while avoiding both wild animals and hostile humans required every bit of her survival skills and more.
She loved her son deeply, but his existence was a constant reminder of the trauma that had created him.
Arcas grew quickly and showed signs of his divine heritage, but Callisto had to be constantly vigilant to protect him from the dangers of their isolated existence. She taught him the skills of hunting and survival that Artemis had once taught her, passing on knowledge that had been meant for sacred service but now served only basic survival. The final tragedy of Callisto's story came when Zeus's wife Hera discovered the existence of another child born from her husband's infidelity. Unable to punish Zeus directly, Hera turned her wrath upon Callisto, transforming her into a bear as punishment for attracting divine attention. This transformation was perhaps the cruelest fate yet. Callisto retained her human mind and emotions, but was trapped in the body of a dangerous wild animal. She could no longer communicate with her beloved son Arcas, who grew up not knowing that the bear he occasionally encountered in the forest was actually his mother. The irony was devastating. Callisto, who had once been the most skilled hunter in Artemis's service, was now the hunted, forced to flee from the very humans she had once lived among. For years, Callisto lived as a bear, while watching her son grow into a skilled hunter, never able to reveal her identity or express her maternal love. The constant fear that Arcas might one day hunt her, not knowing who she truly was, added psychological torment to her physical transformation. When Arcas was grown, he did indeed encounter the bear that was his mother and prepared to kill her, not recognizing the human intelligence in her eyes. Only Zeus's last-minute intervention saved them both, as he placed both mother and son among the stars as the constellations Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. But even this apparent mercy came too late to restore their lost years together or heal the trauma of their separation. Callisto's story demonstrates how Zeus's desires could destroy not just individuals, but the most fundamental bonds between parent and child. Looking at these individual stories together, we begin to see clear patterns in how Zeus's relationships with mortals typically developed, and what common elements characterized these tragic encounters. The first pattern is the complete absence of genuine choice or agency on the part of the mortals involved. Whether Zeus used force, deception, or manipulation, his lovers were never truly free to accept or reject his advances. Divine desire was presented as inevitable fate rather than romantic courtship, making resistance futile and consent meaningless. Even in cases where the mortals appeared to willingly participate, such as Antiope's apparent attraction to the satyr, the fundamental power imbalance between god and mortal made true consent impossible. This absence of genuine consent reveals fundamental issues about power and authority that extended far beyond individual relationships to encompass the entire structure of divine-mortal relations in Greek mythology. The gods, as immortal beings with supernatural abilities, possessed advantages that made any interaction with mortals inherently unequal and potentially exploitative. Zeus, as the most powerful of all gods, embodied this power imbalance to its fullest extent, making his relationships with mortals essentially coercive, regardless of the specific tactics he employed. The mythological framework that presented these relationships as romantic or even flattering to the mortals involved served to obscure their fundamentally predatory nature. The concept of divine right that underpinned ancient Greek theology made it impossible for mortals to refuse divine attention without committing acts of impiety that could bring catastrophic punishment upon themselves and their communities. This theological understanding created a cultural context where resistance to divine desire was not just futile, but potentially blasphemous, eliminating any real possibility of refusal or negotiation. The gods were understood to be operating according to cosmic principles that transcended human moral categories, making their behavior inherently beyond criticism or resistance from mortal perspectives. The psychological impact of this powerlessness on Zeus's lovers was profound and long-lasting, affecting not just their immediate circumstances, but their fundamental sense of identity and agency. Women who had previously been subjects of their own lives suddenly found themselves reduced to objects of divine desire, valued not for their individual qualities or achievements, but solely for their ability to satisfy a god's momentary whim. This objectification was particularly devastating for those who had previously enjoyed positions of authority or independence, such as priestesses, queens, or huntresses who had built their identities around their roles and abilities. The social consequences of divine attention were equally devastating, as communities struggled to understand and respond to the supernatural disruption of normal social order. Families were torn apart by the loss of daughters and wives to divine abduction. Kingdoms were destabilized by the political implications of royal women bearing divine children. And religious institutions were thrown into crisis when their priestesses became targets of the very gods they served. These disruptions created ripple effects that could last for generations, reshaping entire societies around the consequences of divine intervention. The second consistent pattern is Zeus's systematic use of deception to achieve his goals, revealing a character more concerned with conquest than genuine affection. He appeared as animals, other people, natural phenomena, and even other gods, demonstrating that his desire was focused on possession rather than relationship. These disguises allowed him to bypass normal social protections and exploit the trust and vulnerabilities of his targets. The deceptions were often elaborate and psychologically sophisticated, showing that Zeus understood mortal psychology well enough to manipulate it effectively, but cared nothing for the emotional damage such manipulation would cause. The elaborate nature of Zeus's deceptions reveals the calculated and predatory mindset that characterized his approach to mortal relationships. Each disguise was carefully chosen to exploit specific vulnerabilities or desires in his intended victim, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that he used purely for manipulative purposes. The bull form used to deceive Europa appealed to her innocent love of beautiful creatures, while the swan disguise that fooled Leda exploited her compassionate desire to help a creature in apparent distress. The golden rain that penetrated Danae's prison was designed to seem miraculous and divine rather than threatening, making her believe she was experiencing a blessing rather than an assault. These deceptions required extensive preparation and planning, suggesting that Zeus spent considerable time observing and studying his intended victims before approaching them. He would have needed to understand their daily routines, their emotional vulnerabilities, their relationships with family and friends, and their deepest desires and fears in order to craft disguises that would be effective. This stalking behavior adds another disturbing dimension to his predatory pattern, making his eventual assaults the culmination of extended periods of surveillance and psychological manipulation. The psychological sophistication of Zeus's approach is particularly evident in cases where he impersonated trusted figures or appealed to his victims' noble qualities.
His impersonation of Amphitryon to deceive Alcmene required intimate knowledge of her husband's appearance, mannerisms, and personal history, suggesting either divine omniscience or extensive spying on the couple's private life.
His appearance as Artemis to Callisto was specifically designed to exploit her religious devotion and trust in her patron goddess, turning her deepest spiritual commitments into weapons against her. The use of religious and spiritual elements in Zeus's deceptions was particularly cruel, as it violated the sacred trust that mortals placed in divine protection and guidance. When he appeared as Artemis to Callisto or used divine dreams to pressure Io, he was corrupting the very religious framework that was supposed to provide mortals with safety and spiritual comfort. This corruption of religious experience made it impossible for his victims to maintain faith in divine protection, destroying not just their immediate sense of safety, but their entire spiritual worldview. The emotional damage caused by these elaborate deceptions often proved more lasting and devastating than the physical harm of the assaults themselves. Victims who had been tricked into trusting their attackers faced the additional trauma of realizing how completely they had been manipulated and deceived. Europa's trust in the beautiful bull, Leda's compassion for the distressed swan, and Callisto's joy at seeing her beloved goddess were all transformed retroactively into sources of shame and self-doubt, making the victims question their own judgment and instincts in ways that could affect all their future relationships. Thanks for watching this video, and as we reflect on these timeless stories of love, loss, and transformation, may we carry forward their lessons of compassion, resilience, and hope into our own lives and relationships, creating a world more worthy of the courage and dignity demonstrated by these legendary figures. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.